Hello, everyone. Happy Cinco de Mayo, and welcome to the May session of Dr. Spotfire. My name's Neil Kanungo. I'm your host, and today we're going to be talking about information links. So to get started, first, our motto with Dr. Spotfire is learning is driven by answers, learning is not driven by answers, but is driven by questions. And today's session will be recorded and will be put on YouTube, as well as timestamps throughout the session to help you skip through to the topics that are interesting to you and help you go through the recording faster if you'd like. So today's session, I'm joined by Nawaz. He is a senior support engineer. He's one of our top support engineers, very good with Spotfire analysts as well as information services. And he's going to be teaching you everything you need to know about information links. The goal of this session is to be fairly comprehensive. We're going to try to keep it under 30 minutes. We might run a little bit over, but we want to make sure that we touch on everything that you would need to know from setting up, getting going, optimizing, what to consider, things like that.
Good morning, everyone. So let's get started. So as you all know, there are a number of ways to bring the data into Spotfire. One way is direct file access, where you can use the flat files like CSV, XLS, .shape files, SPDF files, and bring it into data and create your reports. The other option is via connector. As you all know, we have multiple data connectors available that you can connect to different data sources and bring in data into Spotfire. The other thing is typical Spotfire Information Services. So using information services, we can connect to and load data from virtually any JDBC data compliant data source. So we have a community link which talks more on the differences between connector versus information services. I would encourage you to look out for this link. But essentially, what I feel is the main differences between connector versus information services comes when the data is loaded. If you're loading the data through the connector, by default, it is external. Whereas with information services, the data is in memory. The other main difference that I usually observe is the data connectors. Like, say, if you are trying to connect to a particular data source, like, say, Teradata, then all the clients that are connecting to the data source Teradata, they will have to install the driver. So in all the machines that are trying to source this data source, will have to download this connector. Whereas for information services, you just need to install and place the JDBC driver in the Spotfire location, which I'm going to talk more in the later slides. So let's go on with the next one. So what is an information services? Like, I see information services as a virtual data warehouse where this information sits on top of existing database and enables us to query like different data tables as one entity, even though they are logically and physically separated. And it allows us to connect data and bring the data from different sources, join different data sources, and create views. Now, this information services essentially can be divided into two areas. One would be the client side. When I talk about client, it means Spotfire analyst, Spotfire web player, business author. And the server side is the Spotfire server. So information services from client side, you can think about it as an interface between document model, the data engine, the server side. And the client side also contains Information Designer, which is a graphical tool which helps to create the information model. Server side, the entire server side is responsible for communication with the data sources. So like creating the connection, generating the query to the data source, bringing the data from the data source, and then sending it to the Spotfire analyst client or any other client. That is essential role of the server in regards to information services. Now, in my previous slide, I talked about information model. Like when I said information designer, it is used to create information model. So now this information model, it is used to retrieve the data from the data sources. This essentially contains the information links and the data source. The information links would essentially have the join elements, the filter element, the column elements, whereas the data source will have the connection details. What are the capabilities of the data source? All of that information will be in the data source. Now coming to data source template. Now imagine, like I will give you a demo on this, but I'll just give you an overview and then I will switch to the demo. So imagine now you want a Teradata source. To have the Teradata source, first you need to have the appropriate JDBC driver, and you need to place it in the Spotfire server installation directory, Tomcat custom extension folder. Starting from 10.3, this is the folder location where we need to keep the JDBC drivers. The other thing is enabling the JDBC data source template. So when you log into the information designer, you will not see the data source right away. You need to enable it. And I have listed down the 2 steps as to how you can enable it by launching the Spotfire configuration tool and under configuration tab, enabling the data source. I will walk you through over this in a demo. So let's get started with the demo as to how we can enable the data source. But before that, let me show you how the information designer looks. So this is my Spotfire analyst. Now, if I go to data information designer, under data sources, I've already set up one data source. I would not edit because like there are some IP addresses that I would want to refrain. So if I set up data source, you will not see all the available data sources. So for this, what you need to do is you need to open your configuration tool. So this is your Spotfire configuration tool. Under configuration tab, you would choose your data source template, and then you will have to enable this Teradata. So once you have the appropriate Teradata driver placed in the Tomcat custom extension folder, and you have enabled this data source, once you save the configuration, restart your server, then you would be able to see the Teradata as a data type, as one of the data connections that you can establish. So these are the steps that you need to follow to have the data source enabled in the information designer. Now say that you are trying to, now like these are the only available data source templates, but say if you want Apache Cassandra as a data source, and that is not listed over here. So what you need to do is that you need to click on this new button. When you click on that new button, this window would pop up. So you would give it a name as Apache Cassandra. And then it needs an XML, like how you see the Teradata XML, you would need an XML, like these essentially contains like the capabilities that can be done in the data source. So this data source template, you can get it from this information. We have one wiki article which talks about what are the content that has to be placed. So if I go to Apache Cassandra, I can take this content over here, then place it in the data source template section, click on OK, and then I need to enable it. So if you see, it says the database driver for Cassandra has not been found. The reason is you need to download the JDBC driver and have it placed in the Tomcat custom extension folder, restart the service, and then you should be able to use the data source over here. So in this demo, I've already set up my data source. I'll just show you as to how my data source looks. And so this is the data source having multiple different databases, and each of the databases will have different tables, and these tables will have the different columns. So now let's get back to our slides, and then we will come back to the Spotfire Information Designer for the next demo. Yeah, so we looked at adding a new data source template, where we looked at if data source template is not available, how we can create a new one. The other thing is setting up data source. Yeah, so as I mentioned, I've already created my data source, but let's see what it takes to set up the data source. So if I click on setup data source, and this is the UI that we look at. And what you need to fill up this information. So the name is just a data source name that you would give. The type is what database you're trying to connect. The connection URL, it generally varies between as to what type of data connection you're establishing. You need to fill in these details with what is the host name, what is the port number, and what is the database name. The number of connections, this field, what it does is, like at any time, how many users can connect to this data source. If I have 1 and 1 selected, like the min and max as 1, what it means is only one user can connect to this data source. The other user will have to wait until the logged in user logs out. Username and password, these are the credentials that you need to enter to connect to this database. If you have checked this user authentication, it means that the user has to authentic, like he needs to provide his credentials whenever he connects to this data source. Checking this allow writing in temporary tables. This is usually used when you are dealing with millions of records and you have multiple join elements. Now, we also have the capability of scheduling specific commands to be executed either when we are opening a database, when we are closing a database, and when we are initializing the database. The fetch size and batch size, these are usually used for performance tuning. The fetch size means like number of values in each block that are like during data retrieval from database. Like this denotes like number of values in each block. Batch size is number of values in each block when we are sending the data to the database. So this is all it needs to set up the data source. Once you have the data source filled in all in this information, you can click on save and it will save your data source. So this is one of the data source that I have created. The same way, like I've entered in all these details, but as I mentioned, I would not edit this because like there are some IP addresses that would want to not show. So yeah, we looked at this information as well. Now let's come back to what is an information link. Information links, these are nothing but database queries. You don't need to write a query in Spotfire. You just need to drag the columns from the data source, and then Spotfire would automatically generate the query for you. Now, when I say that we can directly use the columns from data source, there's a small hurdle over there. So you cannot directly use the columns from the data source directly. You need to map these columns. And there are 3 ways as to how we can map these data source elements, which I'll show you in the demo following. I would also talk a little more on joining different database tables, and then I'll give you a demo as to how we can create the information links and how we can join 2 different tables into one information link. So imagine this use case. Now I have an employee table containing all the different employee details. But this table does not have information about what is the pay rate, what is the pay frequency, and all that information. That is present in a different table called employee pay table. Now, in any database example, like to have 2 tables merged into one table, you need a matching column. So in this example, I'm considering business entity ID, which is a common column in both of these tables as a joining element. And based on that, I would bring in rate change date, rate, pay frequency into this employee table. So I've listed down some high-level steps where I mentioned that I'm creating some mapping columns, and then I'm using a join functionality, and then I'm creating an information link. So let's get started with the demo onto how we can create, like what are the different ways of creating an information link, and how we can join two different data tables. So now I'm going to information design. I go to data sources because this has all the information. I will choose one database. Now, to create an information link, ideally you click on this create information link, and then try using this column. So as I mentioned, you cannot use this elements or these columns directly from the data source to add it into information link. As you see, it is grayed out. So we need to map it. So I'll show you as to how we can do it. Now, if I select the table department, say if I want to create an information link for this department table. Now, if I click on this, right click it, and if I say create default information model, what it will do is it will do the mapping as well as it will create the information link automatically. I will, just so that you can identify it properly, I will create it under create IL. I have some two folders, multiple column and single column. Now, when I create this information model, a new folder would be created under create IL for department along with an information link. So let's see that. I right click, I say create default information model, and then I would choose create IL as the folder. Click on OK. Now you see that a new folder department has been created as well as an information link department has been created. If I edit this, then you can see that the mapping has been performed. Like an element department ID has been created, and it is like, if you see the path, it is data source adventure works, which table it is, and the column name. So this information link has been created. Now, how do I open this information link? You can go click on this flyout, browse the library, go to create IL, and then click on this information link, and it will bring in the data for you. So department table has been created. Now, similarly, let's look at what are the other two different ways, like of creating the information link. But the easiest way is going to the data source, right-clicking, and create default information model. The other way is using multiple columns. So in multiple columns, like when you select this feature, or multiple columns, or the single column options of creating elements, what will happen is you will create the mapping, and then once the mapping has been done, you would create the information link. So let me show you how we can do it with multiple columns. So I select multiple columns, and then I add in all the columns that I want into the information link. Now, I'm just adding 3 columns. I do not want the modified date. So I just want the 3 columns. So I selected multiple columns, and I added multiple columns over here. And I'll say create columns. And I will create these columns in the folder called multiple columns. Initially, this multiple column folder is empty. Now, when I create columns and I go into elements, multiple columns, 3 columns have been mapped. Now, I need to create an information link. So what I will do is I'll click on this create information link, and then I will add these 3 columns to this information link. My information link now contains only 3 columns. Now I will save this under create IL multiple columns. I'll give it a name. So when I like it's the same way now. Again, I need to go to the library and then open the information link. But for simplicity purpose, I'll just click on open data. What it will do is it will open the information link directly. So only 3 columns have been added in this because we created the information link only with 3 columns. So similarly, one last way of creating an information link is using this column. It is similar with that of multiple columns. In multiple columns, you can choose multiple columns for mapping, whereas in regards to this column, you can only do the matching or do the mapping for 1 column. So after I add 1 column, this gets disabled. So what I need to do is that I need to save this. So I'm saving it in single column. I'll give it a name as department ID. And if say I want another column as well, what I need to do is that I need to add it again, save that into single column, department name. And then I create the information link with just these 2 columns. And then when I open the data, you would see the information link will have only just 2 columns. So this is about creating information links. Now let's discuss the other use case that we had where we were trying to join 2 tables. So using that multiple columns, I've created 2 folders where I'm doing the mapping for all the columns of the employee table and all the columns of the employee pay history. Now I want to join both of these tables and bring it as one information link. So if I add all the columns of the employee, and if I choose pay frequency and rate from the second column and I add it, and when I click on open data, this will fail because there is no matching column. So if I do that, you see that the information link has failed. The reason being we didn't create any join. So how do we create joins? To create a join, you would come to this start tab, and then you would click on this create join. When you create join, then what you need to do is locate your tables of interest. In our case, it's employee table and then employee pay history. And I mentioned that I would use business entity ID as the matching column. So I select business entity ID from employee, and then I would choose business entity ID from the employee history. And then I need to create some join. So there are different join conditions which we have. I will choose left outer join. And then now this is nothing but a join element. Join to join employee table and employee pay history. So let me save this join element, and I'll save this under join table. My join table now has information about the employee, employee pay history, and then a join that we created based on business entity ID. So now when we create the information link, we need to add all the columns of the employee, the columns that are of interest from the other table, which would be pay frequency and pay rate. And then under join path, I need to add this employee pay history join that we created. I can directly add it over here. If not, I can ask Spotfire to suggest me a join, and Spotfire is smart enough to understand which join it needs to use, and it will automatically add it. Now, when I click on Open Data, this should not throw an error, and it should bring in all the information that I need. So I have all the employee-related information, and as well as I have the pay frequency and the rate as well. So this is the way as to how we can join two different tables. Yeah, so we discussed, we just looked at different ways of creating an information link and how we can join two data tables using an information link. Now, let's look at the different options we have for limiting data and information link. My data, like what I'm showing you, it has some like limited number of records. But imagine you have data sources which has millions of records, and it would take, it is too much of an overhead to head to the database, bring the data, and then again send it to the Spotfire analyst. So instead, you can bring in the data of your interest. Now, how we can do that is using this limiting data options. The different ways we can limit the data is information link with filters, information link with prompts, loading data on demand, and caching. So I'll give you an small demos for each of this so that it can improve your performances. Now, let's look at information link using filters. Now, I added the employee table. I opened the data. And there are 290 rows over here. Say you do not want all the 290 rows. You want to look at the data only where the organization level, if it is greater than 2, you want to see only those employees. So how we can achieve that is using filters. Now, to do that, you need to create a filter element. And how do you create a filter element? It would be under Start. So you would choose Filter. You would select the table, and then you would choose the organization level. And you would say, so this is an expression for the column that we have. You would say greater than 2.
And this is
then you would.
Yeah, I'm just gonna just to clarify for the audience. So, I mean, you can filter the data within Spotfire, within the analyst, within your DXP, but that would require you to bring all the data over from information services, from your information link. And you have to wait for all of that data to load, and then you would be filtering it out in your DXP. So what Nawaz is showing is actually filtering out in the information link source itself, so that the data you don't need never gets brought in and you don't have to wait for it to load. So I'm seeing some questions in the chat and questions in the Q&A about wondering when you do things and, you know, joins and things in the information link side, when you do things in the Spotfire side. And it just depends on like how much data you actually want to load into your Spotfire application, into your DXP. Information links are always loaded in memory. So all the data is actually sent into the Spotfire system. Sorry, Nawaz, just wanted to point that out with the questions that were coming up.
Thank you, Neil. That was necessary. Yeah, that's true. So yeah, I'll show you as to why I'm creating this filtering element. So now, when I say organization level greater than 2, and I will go ahead and I will save this filter element under using filters. So under filter, using filter, I see the filter that we have just created. Now, if I add this filter, look at how my query would change. It would change as get me all of this data where organization level is greater than 2. So what you are sending the database is, instead of getting me the entire data, just get me the organization level, just get me the employee details where the organization level is greater than 2. So when I click on open data, now see when the 290 records over here, they will change from 290 to a number less than that. So it has changed from 290 to 256 because there are less number of users or the employees in organization level 1 and 2. So that's where it's 256. But if you feel that, okay, I still want to look at only the employees whose gender is female, then what you can do is you can also use the filter section over here, and you can choose the column that you want, say gender, and then you can either give like say if you are using some integer column, then you can set the range, what is the minimum value to the maximum value. But as this is categorical, I'll just say value, and then I will add the value as female. Now look at how the query will turn out. It will say as where organization level is greater than 2 and gender is female. Now when I open the data, from 256 rows, it will drop even more. So it has come only to 71 rows. So this 71 rows has information only about females. The gender has only female, and then organization level is either 3 or it is 4. So this is one way as to how you can limit the data using filtering. And as Neil has rightly pointed, this filters are different from the filter that we create in the information links. The filters that we use over here, we use it only after you bring in all the 290 records. Imagine a case where you have some million records. You bring the million records into the Spotfire and then you filter it. Rather than that, you can just get all the employees who are female. So when those million records would come down somewhere to some half of it. So essentially, you are saving some time. So that's the use of using a filter in Information Designer. The next way on how we can limit the data is using prompts. So I have an information link. Let's see what this information link contains. This information link has 712 records. It contains different countries and different cities, and the source information. And essentially, it contains the source information in different cities and different countries. So say suppose I do not want all of this 712 records, and I'm a person who is in the US, and so I would like to see only the stores within the US, and sometimes I would also want to see what are the stores within Australia or Canada. So what I can do is that I can use something called as prompts, where it would let me decide as to what are the records that I'm interested to see when I open the report. So say I would select a column, so I would say country, because I would want to choose what is the country that I'm interested to see. And I would choose single selection. Now, when I open the data, it would ask me what is the country that you are interested in. If I select United States and if I say finish, it will bring me the data only for United States. It does not get me all the records like how we had initially 720 records for different countries. Now when I selected only United States, it gets me only United States data. So similarly, you can add some other, like let me add city. And this time, like I can use values, but when I select values, I need to know uphand what are the correct city names. So instead of values, I would select multiple selections. And when I click on open data, it would first ask me, okay, which is the region or which is the country that you're interested in. I select United States. Then I click on next. It will prompt me to select which cities. I can select Albany, Bellevue. And when I say finish, it will bring me the data only for the ones that I selected. And these are the cities that I selected.
Yeah, and I was just going to clarify for the audience. So like what Nawaz is doing here is two sides of a same coin. He's doing the data provider, the IT side, which is creating the information designer. But if you were just a user and you weren't using information designer at all, when you load this information link from your library, you'll get those prompts. So those prompts come, again, when you load the information link. So it's a way for the IT person or the data engineer to create a kind of governed data source and then provide that to the business and allow the business to do filters themselves without having to go into information designer and build custom filters and build those filter expressions. They can do it all from the Spotfire design authoring experience. Sorry, go ahead, Nawaz.
Yeah, just for time simplicity, like I'm doing everything from the information designer, but if not, if you save these information links, the same way as how we initially did, like let me quickly show that as well. So if I go to browse the library and use prompts, and when I open this, so it would give me these prompts, and then I can bring in the data. Oh, I'm sorry, I just added it as a record. Like I inserted rows for this. So never mind. So yeah, we looked at how we can use the filters, how we can use the prompts. Now there is another way.
And there's a question about the prompts, pre-filtering. So yes, when you select something by the prompt, only the data that matches your prompt selections, only the data that you specified gets loaded into Spotfire, gets sent in. So, I mean, one thing you're kind of keeping in mind here is the in-memory aspect of this. Is the information links are loaded in memory. So the more data you send over the wire, the more data you send from the databases, from the information links into your Spotfire analysis, whether that's on your analyst or whether that's going to the web player, the more data will, that increases the load time. But by doing these filterings and these prompts, you reduce the data that's sent over the wire. You reduce the data that has to be loaded in when the analysis is opened.
Yeah, so the other way as to how you can limit the data is by loading the data on demand. For this, let me open one of the files. So now, initially when we looked at one report where we had stores, like the stores data within different regions, we had 720 records. But imagine a case where you have just 5 records, like for the different countries that we have, and based on the selections of your markings, like Australia or Canada, you can also send a query to the database to get me the records only based on the markings that I do in this visualization. That is how an on-demand would work. So I would use the same vAddresses data, sorry, vStore with addresses table. I will add it as a new table, and when I import it, I would say it is on demand. So what on demand is that I'm assigning, like I'm defining inputs. I'm saying, so I'm defining the input for the country. I'm saying, define this input based on the values of the column. So the table that you see in the background where you have just 6 country names, that is called as country. In that country, I'm using the country column, and I'm selecting this marking. And I would also have the load automatically and allow caching over here. Let me add, so this restore addresses with addresses, this is initially empty, but when I select the country, when I mark it, it will bring me the data based on whatever markings I have performed. So like if you, like essentially we use, like SQL log is the log which contains all of this information. So if we look into view logs, and if I go and choose sql.log, let's go to the end of it. So this sql.log has all the information, like what is the query being sent to the data source, and what is the time it takes. So look at how the query is generated. It says like it is asking you to get everything from like vstore with addresses based on the country region name as Canada. Now, say if I selected France, this query will change again, where it would have the country as France. So this is how on-demand works. The other thing is based on caching. So if you select or if you enable this checkbox, what it will do is instead of getting the data, like instead of hitting the database every time, it will try to bring in the data from the cache. Usually, like I'm not pretty sure on the exact location, but there is a folder in the Spotfire server which will store all of this cache information. So instead of hitting the database, it will get the data from the cache. I'm not sure on the exact location as to where it would be stored, but I can probably look and then share this information later. While coming to the architecture, now the client over here, it represents the Spotfire analyst, the business author, and the web client. So when you open an information link from the client, it will communicate to the TIBCO Spotfire server over HTTP and SOAP. And the Spotfire server will check with the Spotfire database as to know what is the information model it is being used. And it then contacts the data sources through JDBC and fetch in the data, do the joins if necessary, and then stream that data back to the Spotfire client. So all of the communication with the data sources is usually handled by the Spotfire server. So this is the architecture of the information designer. Now, most often we get use cases from customers saying that the performance of the information link is not up to the mark. So the primary reasons for the performance could be the database performance, network performance, the resources available to the TIBCO Spotfire server. Like the best thing or the best bet what we do is we try to execute the query in third-party tools like DB Visualizer, which uses this, and we need to make sure that it uses the same JDBC driver. And we run the query, the query that we saw in sql.log, and we try to see how much time it takes in the Spotfire server, in the information designer, with that of the query execution time in the third-party tools like the DB Visualizer. So if you look at this, so this is the query that is usually being sent to the data sources to fetch the data, and this piece of information will tell you how much time it took to execute that query. You might also want to look at this one. This is the total time it took to get the data from the data source, and it also includes the total time that the server took to send that data to the Spotfire analyst, the Spotfire client. So essentially, you would use this query on your third-party tool like DB visualizer and compare if the execution time, if they are same or different. So when you compare, there could be two things. One is either the timings are same in the third-party tool as well as the Spotfire. The other one is the timings are better in third-party tool in compared to Spotfire server. If the timings are equal, then it means that the performance degradation is not caused by the Spotfire server, as we are seeing the same time in the third-party tools as well. It is not a Spotfire server issue. The user need to look at the database and their network. But if the timings are better in the third-party tools and the time for opening that information link is more in the Spotfire, then you need to probably look at the Spotfire server health, like how much, look at the resources of the Spotfire server. This KB article that we have, it gives an very good information on how we can troubleshoot the performances. I would highly encourage, whenever you have the Spotfire server, Spotfire Information Designer information link performance issues, I would highly encourage to look at the few steps that we have where we configure the metadata validations differently. So that's a small overview that I have on the information services. I would also like to point out that quarterly, the Spotfire support team, we send out quarterly newsletters to all our customers. And I would highly encourage you to subscribe to our newsletters. So our few of the newsletters that we published are available in this location. If you search for Spotfire support quarterly newsletter, we've published one and we are going to publish it soon. So if you want to subscribe to this, Neil would share you out link. So if you are a new user, you may want to choose this one. If you are an existing user, choose this one, and please make sure that you have checked on the newsletter option to subscribe and get the Spotfire newsletters, where we give you more information to what are the news, what are the security hotfixes we have, latest knowledge base articles, and much more information in the newsletters.